And now we would like to go to a discussion. So, Mr. Masuda will ask a question or make comments on 3 presentations, and then we will receive the reply or the comments from the 3 speakers to those questions and by Mr. Masuda. Mr. ARAKAKI, thank you very much. I am Masuda from the NIS. This is the virtual format. However, we have excellent presentation from Australia and China and also from Japan. Mr. Yamazoya, I see you all the time, but I am very happy to have this kind of interaction this time. Chinese diplomacy and international affairs, and that is the area of my expertise. So from the viewpoint of China, maybe my questions might be asked. Roughly speaking, I'd like to make 2 comments or remarks. The first of all, in the larger theme of confrontation among the major powers, especially since 24th of February, Russian factor positioning, that has been discussing to how much extent should we discuss this Russian factor, or under what context should we discuss this, especially in Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. This theater in front of us, how should we regard Russia? That will require a calm discussion, in my view. Well, the great power competition that has been repeated all the time throughout the history. So this is the common phenomenon in the history, but how this time is different from the past great power competition. That is what we would like to discuss. So driving force this discussion is the emergence of China. The power balance change, or the emergence of power of China. The structure of Asia in the international context has changed. So this was also explained by Dr. Beasley as the background for the emergence of unilateralism. And another factor for the great power competition, in my view, is the United States. The U.S. stance toward China has drastically changed, and also the antagonistic approach of the United States to China has been a driving force. So the policy change is another factor. So because of the change in the course and the change in the policy, we are now entering into the strategic competition between the U.S. and China, and that has grabbed our attention. As Mr. Dr. Yamazoe mentioned earlier, in this context, the Ukrainian war erupts, and how should we think about the Russian factor in this context? Well, a Russian factor, Indo-Pacific area in front of us, how does this Russian factor function? Under what kind of a context? As has been mentioned by Dr. Yuji, originally, for the United States, a major competition is the confrontation with China. That is where the United States allocate more resources to. However, with the protraction of the Ukrainian war, the U.S. If the U.S. pace of allocation of the resources has changed, and then I think in that way that the Russian factor plays a role here. And with that as a precondition, I'd like to ask 3 questions to each speaker. First of all, Dr. Beasley, Nixon. Well, in your presentation, of course, you put China at the front. In the deepening confrontation between the U.S. and China, the significance and the limits of unilateralism was mentioned by Dr. Beasley. That is my understanding. Indo-Pacific or in Asia-Pacific in front of us, in the context of unilateralism, how should we deal with Russia? That is something we would like to hear from you. What is your take on that? Well, for example, Quad, you are right. The concerted stance toward Russia cannot be hammered out by Quad. You are right. And the Japanese government, for example, in the future, would like to position Quad as an important tool against China. In order to maintain and strengthen Quad, Japan, in my view, does not think about the strengthening stance from the Quad toward Russia. Considering the India, maybe the maintaining and strengthening Quad will be difficult in dealing with Russia. So, in the minilateralism, how to deal with Russia and how to deal with Russia, how to strike a balance between the two. Could you please give us some hint or your insight? And the second question is Dr. Yuji. Your presentation was quite clear-cut, and thank you very much for your concise presentation. Well, following up on this comment, Dr. Yuji mentioned the Sino-Russia relationship. It was quite insightful. As a result of the Ukrainian war, whether the China-Russian partnership is maintained. For the time being, it is maintained, including this afternoon's session. We are divided among the needs experts, including the future prospects. Well, from the viewpoint of the experts on China, the China-Russian relationship has been maintained, driven by leadership. However, Mr. Xi Jinping cannot make their relationship open, and also in the form of being pressured from the United States, they cannot increase their assertiveness against China publicly. However, for the time being, I think China-Russia relationship will be continued. But Russia represents international injustice, and under that context, the maintaining relationship with Russia will be a disadvantage or for the China, and therefore how that China can maintain the relationship with Russia may require further discussion. In the Dr. Yuji's presentation, what was quite interesting is in relation to the each can act freely. As for the China-Russia relationship in terms of military and security perspectives, which means that each party can act freely. The question here is that each party has scope for a free act. Is it adjusted and coordinated a free act? To how much extent that the coordination has been made for each party to act freely? In my mind, there might be some gap, and the Shanghai cooperative cooperation and Vladivostok conference the other day. To how much extent I wonder that China and Russia are coordinated with each other for their collaboration, whether coordination function is properly functioning or not. That is what I'd like to hear from you. And the last question to Dr. Yamazoe. As I mentioned earlier, and also as alluded by Dr. Yamazoe, there is a limitation or limits to Russia. What Putin wanted was the approval of Russia's authority in the former sphere of influence. Within the bigger framework of the global framework, does Putin wanted to have an influence on the global international relationship? Putin wants to see the multipolar world. Maybe getting an approval for his sphere of influence is what he would like to get. But how should we understand how Putin would like to influence the structure about that, the international relations or international affairs about that? And you said that the relationship with China might be limited. Then the Putin's intent shown in the Ukrainian war might be difficult to be achieved. If that is the case, is Russia forced to change the course? Well, in the international politics, maybe we do not try to disclose the intent. That is the common sense, but with what should we probe the intent of Putin? That is my question. For my better understanding, taking this opportunity, and Dr. Edowak is also here. How should we understand the intention and the capability of China? That should be carefully understood. Depending on definition of a great power competition, the power and the value. This is the strive for the supremacy of a power, and also this is the strive over the order. When I am studying on China, I sometimes become more Chinese than the actual Chinese, and sometimes I feel uncomfortable about this kind of definition. Well, I am not trying to root for or take the sides with China. Talking about power, the source of Chinese power is not coming from the security, it comes from the economy. And whether the Chinese economy is sustainable or not, it is recently becoming dubious. Then decoupling may come into play. So this has become a determinant that might be important for China. Security, politics, and military. From the viewpoint of the Chinese power, they are not equipped with the full sufficient military power, security power. The U.S. Chinese military muscle has been strengthened. However, what China can do on their own in comparison with the United States would be limited. However, in terms of the GDP transition and the military transition, they are not equal. So even if the China gains economic power, I think that is something that the China is fully aware of. So there is a limit to Chinese power. And what is it that the China viewed its influence in the international securities? Specifically, on individual cases, there might be area that the China viewed its influence in international securities. However, when we look at this region, the China is the target of the threat from this region. So the security muscle cannot be shared between the members of this region and China. So, in terms of the provision of interest, the U.S. dominance will continue. The philosophy and the value. As the Chinese says that their discourse power is limited, that they are not expansive. Although they are saying the global security framework, however, that is against by Russia and China, Russia and India. To how much extent China would like to fight over order? Well, as a consequence, great power competition is occurring. This might be the question to Dr. Yuji, or maybe should I ask to Dr. Beasley? From your perspective, the limits of China. So when we think about the various limitations of Chinese power, what kind of actor is China in terms of international securities. What is your take on this from Australia? And as a result,
So China's rise and increasing anxiety on the U.S. side is causing a competitive situation which is defined as great power competitions. However, until some time before, we were talking about how to combine comparison, competition, and hedging. So when we talk about great power competition, we sometimes mean that China cannot be integrated into one existing international order. So do you think that the option of coexisting with China in a single international order, is it fine for us to abandon that option completely? And China's rhetoric has been kind of fluctuating. They say that they live in the same world as the United States. However, they do not specifically say they are living in the same order. They sometimes say they are living in the same architecture instead of order. So from the three presenters' point of view, it is okay to abandon this option completely, yes or no? That was my final question to the three presenters. Thank you very much. Very insightful questions and comments. So one question to each presenter about their own presentations, and one common question was about the intent and capability of China. Are we overestimating China's intent and capabilities? How should we assess their intent capabilities? And in the international order in Asia-Pacific region, how should we position China? Those questions were to all of the three presenters. So we'd like to start with Dr. Beasley, and then go to Dr. Yoji, and then go to Dr. Yamazoe. So, Dr. Beasley, could you start?
Thank you, Masuda-san. Excellent questions and discussion. There's a lot there. Let me start with the specific question about Russia and minilateralism. As I was hinting at in my remarks, Russia acts as a complicating factor in minilateralism, and that's primarily because the Quad and AUKUS, to some degree, are both organized around China, and they're focused in on the challenge that China represents. And because both are focused, at least in the first instance, on security cooperation narrowly understood, it's their ability to manage external third-party, fourth-party interactions and how they may complicate the minilateral ambitions is somewhat limited. And I think the Quad experience with Ukraine and India's positioning is illustrative of that. Diplomatically, the Quad has shown that they are, at least in public, putting a very positive face, saying things like India is able to have its own relationship with Russia, but below the surface, this is causing a problem. And I think it will make the effort to coordinate policy outside of the specific issue around China much more difficult, particularly if, in the future, Russia and China present a more concerted face to strategy in Asia. Ukraine is a second-order problem from an Indo-Pacific point of view because it's, over there, so to speak. If Russia and China coordinate their activities in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean, then I think it'll become a first-order problem, and how they manage it, I think, will be quite interesting. It also presents a vulnerability for that multilateralism because of the divergence of interests. It means that if you're China or some other third party, you can use that as a way of sort of putting a wedge within the minilateral cooperation. So I think Russia is a useful reminder of the complications of coordinating security policy with countries whose interests and global interests are in fact quite diverse. And I think that's a challenge that the Quad is only really beginning to wake up to. On the larger question of China and what kind of power it is, I think to step back, it's important to recognize the larger issue you raised in your opening remarks, which is what's the nature of great power competition today. And I think one of the distinguishing features is that great power competition is existing in the context of globalization and a really profound interdependence between the great powers of a kind we've never seen before. I mean, people will sometimes say Germany and Britain prior to World War One had a significant amount of economic interdependence, but that's nothing compared to the not just the production and investment ties between the US and China and the global order, but also the financial connections and networks that bind them together. So that context makes it really, really different. And it also means that China, even though China is in its military terms, and I think Dr. Luttwak will be talking about this shortly, even in its military terms is much more constrained, and it's clearly not at the same level as the United States on global force projection or any of those major metrics. The nature of its economic power in a globalized world means that it has to be taken very seriously, particularly given its ability to use that economic power to buy political support, and I mean that literally, to purchase political support or to drive economic relationships that align countries' interests with its own. And I think sometimes the democratic West and the liberal capitalist West forgets just how many people and how many countries are outside its orbit and are quite happy to be involved in supportive, mutually beneficial relations with the People's Republic of China. So I think the PRC does need to be taken seriously as a major power because of that basic setting. And the other reason I think we really need to take the PRC seriously is the ambition that Xi Jinping's leadership has for China. He has made very clear repeatedly in public his ambition to make China the preeminent power in the world and to reorganize the immediate international environment around China and the broader global setting into one that's much more conducive to the PRC and to party interests. If he succeeds in this, and that's a big if, but if he is to succeed in this ambition, that is a radical transformation of the world that we have had since 1945, in which the North Atlantic powers and a few others established a world that suited their values and interests. So I think we really do need to take the PR seriously. And I think that's partly why, to bring it back to the Australian context, Australia is particularly unnerved by the rise of Chinese power for a couple of reasons. If you look at what we have done in reaction to China, it's much more further along. It's a much more significant set of changes than you might anticipate for a country that, whose population base is 10,000 miles away from, or not 10,000 kilometers away from the east coast of China. But we've done so because we feel threatened by the PRC in terms of destabilizing a regional order on which we depend for our prosperity and success. So we have as our most important interest a stable Asia-Pacific regional order, and that is challenged by the PRC. We have a profound interest in an open, liberal international order, and that's being challenged by the PRC. And we've experienced, although I think we've overreacted to it, we've experienced efforts by the PRC to interfere in our domestic politics. They've actually been pretty limited and pretty unsuccessful, but they're there. And those three things together have really brought out a quite almost allergic reaction in security policy terms by governments of both sides of the political aisle. So I think the sense within, if you take Australia as kind of illustrative of countries that have strong economic ties to China, profound links in a global liberal order, and a strong security link with the US as indicative of how states are going to respond, A, we're taking it seriously, and B, we're pretty unsettled by what China represents. I'll leave it there given time constraints.
Oh, okay. Yes, the question to me have four aspects. The first one, how China would trade Russia and the vice versa. I think the war has planted seeds of doubt in each of the two capitals. As far as Russia is concerned, it cannot receive the support, the most urgently needed support from China, particularly the military equipment such as unmanned combat vehicles and so on and so forth, and electronic measures. So that has planted some ill feelings as far as Russians are concerned. As far as Chinese are concerned, I think the war was waged in the first place not in China's fundamental interests. China was put into a dilemma, a catch-22 situation, helplessly. Now, for the Chinese, they would they would think what else Russia could do in regard to Chinese interests in the future. So this kind of thing will linger on for a long, long time to come. Second aspect of the question is summit diplomacy. Probably the leaders, the trust between the two leaders, I think they will continue. Both leaders enjoy very good relationship, personal good relationship, and that has played a very, very crucial role as far as Putin is concerned to wage such a war from a difficult situation in the first place. And for China, China would always think of the issues on the war and the peace from the worst case scenario options. If China provoked it into a similar action as Russia did, for example, in the Taiwan Strait, I think Russia would be a very much positive factor to pin down US and NATO forces in the European theater. And this very fact would outweigh all other unpleasant feelings or even conflicts of interest between them. So this has dominated the Chinese thinking of maintaining good relationship with Russia, and probably the same thing can be said from the Russia side. So the bilateral relationship will be based on the best self-interests on each of the two capitals, and for the Chinese, at this moment, avoiding a war would be its most crucial self-interest. But in the future, when war becomes unavoidable, situation may change. But in the meantime, China would avoid a situation where it has to be dragged into something it does not want to. So this is the third aspect. The last aspect, the naval thing. I think the coordination and the cooperation will be maintained at a high level, let me say at the strategic level. For example, China has participated in Russian-China military drills at the strategic level by sending at least we call the brigade a level of troops, the fleet level of naval forces to join the exercises and to go through the sensitive and controversial areas. That shows very, very clearly that China has been prepared for some backlashes from such participation. However, China is going ahead with those cooperation and coordination. Anyway, I think the war may put the Chinese to think again of what kind of commitment, military commitment in particular, to strengthening the bilateral relationship post-Ukraine war, because it could also be an active factor to backlash against Chinese interests. But still, as I mentioned earlier, that if the Chinese worst-case scenario dominates the strategic thinking, that if China is provoked into a military conflict, not only with the United States over the Taiwan issue, but also due to the territorial disputes elsewhere in South China Sea and the East China Sea, Russia is still indispensable kind of help that China cannot get rid of. China would want to enhance with. Finally, the Sino-US rivalry, which is really a matter of war and peace. Now, it boils down. The matter boils down to the question whether the U.S. would accommodate China's rise and for how long. That has been the discussion in Australia among our colleagues in Australia for a very, very long time. Now, the answer is increasingly more and more clearer that America would not accommodate continued and indefinite rise of China, then the question arises again. Now, if America does not want to accommodate China's rise, what options America would have? I don't think America has any viable options at all. It's just in choosing between the two devils, two evils, war or not war. Now, even confrontation would not stop China's rise without military option. If it is a war, now everyone suffers, including our Japanese friends and Australia. I'm Australian myself. What I'm trying to say is that facing this kind of option, with or probably the situation of no option. So I don't think America has made up its mind, and China has made up its mind that they would have to prepare for such a worst-case scenario through military preparation, through continued investment in critical industrial and high-tech sectors. Most importantly, to reach what we call the power parity, that is the credible mad capability to enter a era of balance of terror, which could prevent Americans taking actions against China, just like Americans could not take action against Soviet Union in the Cold War era. So that's all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yeo-jin. Then let's turn to Dr. Yamazoe. Thank you very much. The global balance of power for Russia. To speak to that point, regarding order, I think it is unique to Britain or the United States that they are quite sensitive to international order, because in Europe there was an order in the 19th century and that was expanded along the ocean routes by the United States or the Great Britain, and if that attempt is challenged, then they tend to think it is a threat to the international order itself. And Russia, regarding the 19th century international order, Russia perceived it was recognized and accepted into it, and Russia grew in that international order. Russia wants to go back.
So now it's only that the United States acknowledges that's their objectives, but the biggest power that does not recognize the U.S., recognize Russia is the U.S., and therefore Russia tries to hit the right balance between Russia and China. However, it doesn't going to be achieved by the collaboration between China and Russia doesn't have any power to make any plausible proposal. So the intention or intent is yet to be clear. Multipolarism is being mentioned. China and Central Asia countries, they are in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And more than freedom, authoritarian rule is the majority of those countries, and they actually curb freedom of speech, and that is considered to be supreme, and internet will be limited, and that should be the advocate for multilateral or multipolarized society of international relations. And also the lack of power of sphere of influence maintenance by Russia. Russia don't think has given up on controlling Ukraine. However, what we see now is to take away a part of Ukraine and to oppose or force Ukraine to accept that. So the intent has been narrowed. And maybe a few hundred years from now, maybe Russia is intending to recapture Ukraine back, maybe. Now, China, compared with Russia in terms of economic might or other means, China has a lot more than Russia. So the feeling of the Putin administration that is being cornered or no way to corner any further would be hard to be reached by China. Xi Jinping regime would have long way to be feeling that way because there are so many things that China can maneuver, and therefore China doesn't have to risk to take a very aggressive stance. But as far as China's regime is concerned, they have a lot more options and they can draw different decisions. So we have other things to look at to evaluate China's capability, therefore. Thank you. Dr. Yamazoe, thank you very much. Now, we do receive comments from the audience, but because of the time, we would like to not entertain questions. So this is the end of the session 1. Thank you very much for all of you who participated in session 1.